Hello, welcome back to Revolutionary Actions. Day 5, France erupts in violence. We finished the American Revolution, we moved to the French Revolution. Today is day 5, France erupts in violence. Tomorrow will be the Reign of Terror. Question number 1, what happened during the Great Fear? So, peasants heard about the National Assembly and its work at Versailles in 1789, and peasants across France supported the National Assembly's declaration that all people have rights and that the people of France, the Third Estate, are the true France, and that the nobles and the king and the First Estate and the church, they aren't the real France, that the real France is the people. The peasants across France rose up to destroy the nobles' houses, and they also destroyed tax records, rental records, contracts, and debt papers. They destroyed chateaus and took property. And during this whole process, the Great Fear refers to the fear that the nobles had of the peasant uprising. And the fear that these nobles had led them to run away, literally, to other countries. So you can see in the drawing on the left, nobles running away to other countries in Europe. And they're known as émigrés with an E because they were leaving France. These peasants had no real weapons. They had pitchforks, farm tools, machetes, etc. And from 20 July to 6 August of 1789, the peasants instilled a great fear in the minds of the nobles. Why was the storming of the Bastille so symbolic? In Paris, rumors were flying around about the Great Fear and the nobles who had been running away, and some of whom had been imprisoned. Some people were afraid that King Louis was going to use military force to dismiss the National Assembly, and they began to gather weapons to defend themselves against the French army. The King of France, ill-advisedly, sent the army to surround Paris. And on the 14th of August, the people of Paris responded with riots. The National Assembly sent a group called the National Guard, led by our pal, the Marquis de Lafayette, to help the people of Paris to fight against the French army. And the people needed better and more weapons. So they turned to the Bastille. The Bastille was a notorious prison in the middle of Paris. It was an ancient castle, and it was used as kind of a political prison for enemies of the king. And it was notorious, it was legendary for being a place with a reputation for torture, for unfair imprisonment, and for unfair treatment of its prisoners. Political prisoners, people who spoke ill of the king or spoke ill of the nobles, were held there. And so the people of Paris found it appropriate to break into this prison in order to try to find weapons. The guards of the Bastille, the ones that resisted, had their heads chopped off and paraded around on pikes. And the people who broke in were able to get some supplies, but more than the supplies, the value from the storming of the Bastille was two things. The prison itself was destroyed and over the following days was taken apart brick by brick. And during this event, members of the French military who were sent to end the revolt, some of them actually ended up joining the revolt. Some members of the French military who had served in America in the American Revolution switched sides and joined the protests. This is when the real violence of the revolution begins. The Bastille happened in August, and by September, the price of bread had doubled. The poissonnières are the fish women. They're the women who sell fish in the marketplace. And they end up marching to Versailles, where the king is, to demand bread, to demand lower prices for bread, and to demand some kind of change. The women of Paris in particular riot because they are responsible for feeding their families and they just cannot afford enough food to care for their families. By October, the National Assembly is helpless to fix this, helpless to help them. So these women turn to the king. These fish women, these poissonnières, are burly and strong. They're tough. They gut fish for a living. They're good at using very sharp knives. And so when they march to Versailles to confront the king, they are a terrifying mob. They demand bread. They demand that the king and the queen come out of the palace. And the National Guard arrives with them and actually ends up preventing them from murdering the king, but helps them to take the king and the queen prisoner. And then the king, the queen, their family, and several wagons of flour return from Versailles to Paris as prisoners of the Poissonnières, the National Guard, and the French people. This is a Google map from nowadays, but it shows you the distance from the palace at Versailles to Paris. Google Maps estimates that it's a 4.5-hour walk these days on paved roads. Then on rutted dirt roads, it took some people 5 hours. It took some people 9 hours. And it's a big, giant crowd, so it moves a little slower. Number 4, why did King Louis's plan to flee to Austria fail? So King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette, with their 2 children, their nurses, their servants, were taken to the palace inside Paris at the Tuileries. But after a few years of calm, October 1789 to June 1791, during which time the National Assembly tried to negotiate with the king, and the National Assembly debated amongst itself about the creation of a new constitution, the king and the queen took it upon themselves to try to escape. They had a plan to escape to Austria, to the Netherlands, which were part of Austria at the time. But they did this kind of in a silly way. They left in a giant fancy carriage, which was pretty obvious. They were wearing fancy clothes. They stopped along the way several times to take a break. They stopped for meals. And it's not really a big surprise, but they got caught at the town of Varennes. And apocryphally, famously, whether it's true or not, supposedly one of the people at this town recognized King Louis because they recognized his face from the currency. The royal family was captured and they were brought back to Paris, and this time they were really prisoners of the National Assembly. The picture on the bottom right here is kind of a meme from the time. The king was not literally kept in a giant bird cage, but he was this time now very much a prisoner of the French people. And instead of living in the very nice palace, the royal family now lived in less nice conditions. They were actually imprisoned. By September of 1791, there was a new constitution, and it was decided that there would be a constitutional monarchy with serious limits on the powers of the king. What were the September massacres? Why were the Septembristes led by the sans-culottes? So first of all, what's a sans-culotte? Sans-culotte means sans culotte, and this means without short pants or without fancy pants. So what this is referring to is these kind of fancy pants worn by the nobility. Sorry about the watermark, I couldn't find a better picture. But culottes are these fancy pants worn by nobility, worn by rich people, worn by the king. These sans-culottes are the people who do not have fancy pants. So men like this, or like this, or women like this. So these are the people who do not have the fancy pants. The Septembristes are the people who did the massacres. So this time period is known as the September Massacres because les Massacres de Septembre. The September Massacres happened during September. What? I know. And what happened is that after the king tried to run away to Austria, several countries invaded France. Austria, Prussia, armies from other countries start invading France. And the wars start getting the battles start getting closer and closer to Paris. After the king is captured and the royal family is captured, the King of Prussia pretty famously said, if the people of France hurt the king, then the King of Prussia would destroy the city of Paris. And this really only made the sans-culottes, the non-fancy pants people, more angry. In Paris, the shop workers, the city workers, all the regular sort of working class people, the sans-culottes, wanted more change. And they began to fear that the émigrés, the nobles who ran away to the other countries, were working against France. They were working to sort of sabotage France. Then the fear led to maybe the nobles in jail, the nobles who've been imprisoned since the Great Fear way back years ago. Maybe they are secretly working to sabotage the revolution. And so the sans-culottes, the non-fancy pants, they were not part of the government, but they were a powerful faction in the city anyways, riled everybody up to be afraid of foreigners. And part of this fear of the foreigners led to fear of the nobles in jail. So they decided in September of 1792 to attack the nobles who are still in Paris. They actually also went to the prisons of Paris where the nobles were held, and they pulled them out of jail and they murdered them. There were thousands of nobles in jails waiting for their trials, and they were pulled unceremoniously out of prison and murdered. You can see in these pictures here the Septembristes, or the sans-culottes, who in September decided to massacre the nobles, quite violently and aggressively attacking the people. Over 1,000 nobles were killed in this time period. And the September massacres, the Septembristes, were sort of the most violent outrage up until this point in the revolution. To go back one, this is an excerpt from A Tale of Two Cities, which describes part of the September massacres. The last line, Mr. Laurie says, is they are murdering the prisoners. And this describes sort of how riled up, how crazed, how vicious the murderers were. And in the end of all this, the king eventually was executed and the revolution accelerated. We're going to talk more about the king getting executed at the beginning of the next lesson, but for now, these are your 5 questions that you should have summarized for today. Submit your summaries, and tonight's reading is The Reign of Terror.